sister slept with my husband and got pregnant. Now she wants my help after our parents disowned her and left me their $37 million inheritance. She stood on my doorstep at 11:30 on a Tuesday night, mascara streaking down her cheeks like war paint, her pregnant belly straining against a wrinkled designer dress I recognized from her Instagram posts. The porch light cast harsh shadows across her face as she clutched her phone with shaking hands, probably fresh from another argument with whoever had finally seen through her act. "Please," she whispered, the word hanging between us like a prayer I wasn't sure I wanted to answer. After everything she'd done to me, after the years of betrayal and humiliation, now she wanted my help? Let me tell you how we got here. Growing up, I was the reliable Honda in our family driveway, while Melissa was the flashy red Corvette that broke down every month, but somehow always got more attention from the mechanics. You know how it is in some families. There's the golden child, and then there's everyone else. I was everyone else, wrapped up in a single forgettable package. Mom used to say I was her steady one, which sounds like a compliment until you realize it's code for the one we don't have to worry about because she'll never cause any trouble. Melissa, 3 years younger and born with the kind of effortless beauty that made people turn their heads on the street, was the one who got the worried phone calls, the emergency cash transfers, and the endless second chances. I remember being 14, saving up for months for my part-time job at the local bookstore to buy this gorgeous vintage dress for homecoming. It was hanging in my closet, tags still on, when Melissa decided she simply had to have it for some party she'd been invited to at the last minute. When I came home from school that Friday, it was gone. Mom's explanation? She needed it more than you did, honey. Besides, you can always get another dress. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was finding out later that she'd told everyone at the party it was a gift from her boyfriend, the same boyfriend who'd been flirting with me for weeks before she swooped in with her perfect smile and that laugh that could make boys forget their own names. This became the pattern of our relationship. I would work for something, achieve something, build something, and Melissa would find a way to take credit, take the spotlight, or simply take it away from me entirely. When I made honor roll, she'd have a crisis that required all of Mom and Dad's attention. When I got accepted to my dream college, she'd announce some dramatic relationship saga that dominated every family conversation for weeks. The thing about being the steady one is that people start to expect you to just absorb the chaos around you. They expect you to be understanding, to be the bigger person, to quietly step aside so the more dramatic personalities can take center stage. And for years, that's exactly what I did. I went to college, studied hard, graduated with honors, while Melissa dropped out of 3 different schools to find herself. I got my first job at a marketing firm, worked late nights and weekends, slowly climbing the corporate ladder, while she bounced between modeling gigs and failed business ventures that Dad always seemed happy to fund. I met David at a conference in Chicago. He was presenting on digital marketing trends, and I was captivated not just by his expertise, but by the way he listened when I shared my own insights during the Q&A session. He actually heard me, not as someone's daughter or sister, but as a professional with valuable thoughts worth considering. We dated for 2 years before he proposed, and for the first time in my life, I felt like I was the star of my own story. David saw my worth in ways my family never had. He encouraged my career ambitions, celebrated my successes, and made me feel like I deserved to take up space in the world. The wedding planning, though, that's when the old family dynamics came roaring back to life. Melissa had just ended another relationship and was going through what Mom diplomatically called a rough patch. Suddenly, every decision about my wedding became about how it might affect Melissa's fragile emotional state. The date I'd chosen was too close to her breakup anniversary. The venue I'd selected was where she'd had her first date with the ex. Even my choice of maid of honor dresses was somehow insensitive because the color reminded her of something painful.
"Couldn't you just be more considerate?" Mom asked during one particularly exhausting conversation about seating arrangements. "She's really struggling right now." But I held firm. For once in my life, I refused to shrink myself to make room for Melissa's drama. The wedding was beautiful, David and I were happy, and I thought maybe, finally, I'd broken free from the cycle of always putting everyone else's needs before my own. We bought a house in a quiet neighborhood about an hour away from my parents. David got promoted to senior director at his firm, and I launched my own consulting business. Life was good, better than good. It was mine. For 3 blissful years, I maintained what therapists call healthy boundaries with my family. I sent birthday cards, showed up for major holidays, but I didn't get pulled into the weekly crisis calls or the emergency family meetings that always seemed to revolve around whatever mess Melissa had gotten herself into this time. I heard through Mom that she'd moved in with some guy named Marcus, that she was waitressing at an upscale restaurant downtown, that she'd started taking yoga teacher training classes. It all sounded surprisingly stable for Melissa. And I'll admit I felt a cautious optimism that maybe she'd finally grown up. I should have known better. The anonymous text came on a Thursday afternoon while I was in a client meeting. Just a phone number I didn't recognize and a message that made my blood run cold. "Check your husband's phone. The Park Hotel, room 412. Every Tuesday for 6 months." My hands shook as I stared at those words. The rational part of my brain insisted it was probably spam, maybe someone trying to cause trouble, possibly even a wrong number. But something deep in my gut, that intuition women learn to trust when the world feels suddenly dangerous, told me this wasn't random. I waited until David was in the shower that night, then did something I'd never imagined myself doing. I went through his phone. The texts were all there, months of them. Sweet, flirty messages that grew progressively intimate. Photos I wished I could unsee. Plans for their Tuesday afternoon meetings that coincided perfectly with David's standing client lunch, the one he'd told me was with Peterson Industries, the account he'd been nurturing for months. But it was the contact name that made my world collapse entirely. M. Hart. Not just any M. My sister's number. I'd seen it 1,000 times on family group texts. I sat on our bathroom floor, reading through months of betrayal while the shower ran in the background, feeling like I was watching someone else's life fall apart in slow motion. The messages painted a picture of a relationship that had started innocently enough. David reaching out to plan a surprise for my birthday, Melissa offering to help coordinate with the family. But somewhere in those conversations, innocent planning had turned into private jokes, which had turned into meeting for coffee, which had turned into something that shattered everything I thought I knew about my life. The pregnancy news came 3 weeks later, delivered not through a gentle conversation or a family meeting, but through another anonymous text. Ask M about her doctor's appointment yesterday. When I confronted David, he didn't even try to deny it. He just sat at our kitchen table, head in his hands, and said, "I never meant for this to happen." As if intention somehow lessened the impact of the bomb he had detonated in the middle of our marriage. "How long?" I asked, my voice surprisingly steady.
8 months, he whispered. 8 months! While I was building my business, planning our future, talking about maybe starting a family of our own, my husband was creating a family with my sister. The confrontation with Melissa was everything you'd expect and worse. She cried, she apologized, she swore it just happened naturally, as if affairs were weather patterns beyond human control. She begged me to understand, to forgive, to remember that we were sisters, and sisters were supposed to forgive each other anything. But it was my parents' reaction that broke something fundamental inside me. "These things happen," Dad said, as if David and Melissa had accidentally bumped into each other in a hallway instead of deliberately deceiving me for the better part of a year. "What matters now is how we handle it as a family." Mom nodded along, already shifting into crisis management mode. "Melissa needs our support right now. She's scared and alone, and that baby is going to need stability." "What about what I need?" I asked, genuinely curious to hear the answer. The silence that followed told me everything I needed to know. That's when I decided, enough. I filed for divorce the next week. David didn't contest it. I think he was actually relieved. I sold the house, took my half of everything, and moved to a downtown loft that overlooked the city skyline. I threw myself into my consulting business with the kind of focused intensity that only comes from having nothing left to lose. And you know what? It turned out I was really good at it. Within 6 months, I doubled my client base. Within a year, I'd hired 2 employees and was turning down projects because I couldn't keep up with demand. Success has a way of attracting more success, and suddenly I was the go-to consultant for companies looking to revolutionize their marketing strategies. I also started therapy, not because I was falling apart, but because I was determined to understand how I'd allowed myself to become so invisible in my own family. Dr. Martinez helped me see the patterns I'd accepted as normal, the ways I'd been conditioned to shrink myself, to accommodate other people's egos and emotions. You spent so many years being the supporting character in other people's stories that you forgot you could be the heroine of your own, she said, during one particularly insightful session. Meanwhile, the fairy tale romance between David and Melissa was predictably short-lived. Turned out that relationships built on deception and betrayal don't have the strongest foundations. Who could have seen that coming? David lost his job about 8 months after our divorce. Something about irregularities in his expense reports. I heard through mutual friends that he'd been using company money to fund his hotel meetings with Melissa. The Peterson Industries account, the one he'd been supposedly nurturing during all those Tuesday afternoon disappearances, it never existed. Melissa gave birth to a daughter she named Sophie, and for a brief moment, I wondered if motherhood might change her. But within weeks, she was back to her old patterns, calling mom at all hours, demanding emergency babysitting, creating drama wherever she went. David, facing his own financial ruin, grew resentful of the child support payments and the reality of being responsible for another human being. He started missing visits, then stopped showing up altogether. Last I heard, he'd moved to another state to start fresh, leaving Melissa to raise Sophie alone.
I wish I could say I felt vindicated watching their relationship implode, but mostly I just felt sad. Sad for the time I'd wasted, the energy I'd spent, the years I'd allowed other people's dysfunction to define my worth. But I was learning something powerful. The best revenge isn't plotting someone else's downfall. It's building a life so fulfilling that their opinion of you becomes irrelevant. My business continued to grow. I hired more staff, expanded into new markets, and eventually opened a second office in Seattle. I traveled for work, spoke at conferences, and found myself quoted in industry publications as an expert in digital transformation strategies. I also started dating again, carefully, thoughtfully, but with an openness I'd never felt before. I learned the difference between men who wanted to possess me and men who wanted to partner with me. I discovered I had preferences and deal breakers I'd never bothered to articulate before. 3 years after my divorce, I was sitting in my office overlooking the city when my assistant buzzed in with an urgent call from my father. "We need to talk," he said, his voice heavy in a way I'd never heard before. "Can you come over tonight?" I found both my parents in their living room, looking older than I remembered, with stacks of papers spread across the coffee table between them. Bank statements, legal documents, something that looked like a police report. "Sit down, sweetheart," Mom said, and I noticed her hands were shaking. The story came out in pieces, like a puzzle assembling itself in reverse. Melissa had been stealing from them for months, forging checks, using their credit cards, even taking out a loan against their house using forged documents. The amounts were staggering, enough to threaten their retirement, their security, everything they'd worked for over 40 years of marriage. "We didn't want to believe it at first," Dad said, his voice barely above a whisper. "But the evidence." He gestured helplessly at the papers scattered between us. The breaking point had come when they discovered she was selling things from their house. Mom's jewelry, Dad's vintage watch collection, even some of the family heirlooms that were supposed to be passed down through generations. She'd been taking advantage of their love and trust, counting on their desire to protect her to keep them from looking too closely at her activities. "We've cut her off," Mom said, tears streaming down her face. "Changed the locks, closed the joint accounts, everything. But we needed to tell you because," she looked at Dad, who nodded encouragingly, "because we need to make some things right." What followed was the conversation I'd been waiting my entire adult life to have with my parents. They apologized, genuinely, specifically, without qualifications or excuses, for the years of favoritism, for the way they minimized my achievements while excusing her failures, for asking me to be understanding while never requiring her to be accountable. "We enabled her," Dad said simply. "And we failed you, both as parents and as people who should have seen your worth all along." But they weren't done. "We've been talking to our attorney," Mom continued, "about our estate planning. We want to make sure that what's left of our assets goes to someone who will use them responsibly, someone who has proven she can build something meaningful with her life." They handed me a folder containing updated will documents, trust information, and financial statements that made my head spin. The number at the bottom of the final page had so many zeros I had to count them twice. $37 million. My parents had been far more successful with their investments over the years than any of us had realized. Dad's small accounting firm had grown into a regional powerhouse before he sold it. Mom's careful stock picks and real estate investments had compounded over decades. They lived modestly, drove practical cars, and apparently spent their retirement growing a fortune they'd never talked about. "This isn't about punishing Melissa," Dad explained. "This is about rewarding the daughter who chose to build rather than destroy, who chose responsibility over chaos." I sat in their living room, holding documents that represented more money than I'd ever imagined having, feeling strangely calm. This wasn't just inheritance. It was validation, recognition, a formal acknowledgement of the person I'd become despite the family dynamics that could have broken me. Of course, Melissa found out within days. She had her ways of getting information, and news like this doesn't stay quiet in a small family. The phone calls started immediately. Angry, desperate, pleading calls that I let go to voicemail. Then came the texts, the emails, the messages through mutual friends. She tried everything. Guilt, threats, promises to change, appeals to family loyalty. When none of that worked, she showed up at my office building that Tuesday night, 8 months pregnant with her second child. Apparently she'd reconnected with David just long enough for one more catastrophic decision, looking like she'd been living in her car, which, as it turned out, she had been. "I have nowhere else to go," she said, still standing on my doorstep, still clutching that phone like it might save her. "Mom and Dad won't even take my calls. David's gone again. I lost my job, lost my apartment. Please, I know we have history, but I'm your sister." I looked at her, really looked at her, for the first time in years. The designer dress was wrinkled and stained. Her perfect manicure was chipped. The confident smile that had charmed her way through life was nowhere to be seen. This was Melissa stripped of all the advantages that had carried her through 30 years of bad decisions, finally facing the consequences of her choices. Part of me wanted to invite her in, to feed her, to let her sleep on my couch, to prove that I was the bigger person I'd always been expected to be.
But a stronger part of me, the part that had built a business, survived a devastating betrayal, and learned my own worth, recognized this moment for what it was. Not a crisis requiring my rescue, but a choice about who I wanted to be. "I'm sorry you're in this situation," I said, and I meant it, but this isn't my responsibility to fix. "What about Sophie?" she asked, desperate now. "What about the baby? They're innocent in all this."
You're right. They are innocent, which is why you need to make better choices for them. There are resources, shelters, assistance programs, support systems for single mothers. I can give you some phone numbers. I don't want phone numbers, she screamed. I want help from my sister. I want what you got from Mom and Dad. What I got, I said quietly, was 37 years of being invisible, dismissed, and taken for granted. What I built came from deciding that wasn't enough anymore. I stepped back and began to close the door. You're heartless, she spat. You always were. That's why David came to me in the first place, because you're cold and selfish and... I closed the door gently, but firmly, turned the deadbolt, and walked back to my living room, where I poured myself a glass of wine and sat down to think. Was I heartless? Maybe, but I'd learned there was a difference between being heartless and having boundaries, between being selfish and practicing self-care. I'd spent most of my life absorbing other people's chaos, and I was done. The next morning, I called my parents to let them know about Melissa's visit. They weren't surprised. Apparently, she'd tried them first, camping out in their driveway until they'd threatened to call the police. We're worried about the children, Mom said, but we can't keep enabling her. She needs to face the consequences of her choices. It was strange hearing my mother echo the same conclusion I'd reached. For the first time in our relationship, we were on the same side. 6 months later, I was sitting in a conference room in downtown Seattle, signing papers to establish the Sarah Matthews Foundation for Women's Entrepreneurship. The foundation would provide grants, mentoring, and resources for women starting their own businesses, particularly those who'd faced significant personal or professional setbacks. I thought about calling it the Second Chances Foundation, but that felt too much like it was about other people's mistakes rather than women's potential. This wasn't about redemption. It was about recognition. Recognition that women often have to rebuild their lives from scratch, and that they deserve support when they choose to bet on themselves. The foundation's first major event was a luncheon featuring successful female entrepreneurs sharing their stories. I was invited to be the keynote speaker, and as I stood at the podium looking out at 200 women who'd overcome their own challenges to build something meaningful, I felt a sense of purpose I'd never experienced before. Some of you know my story, how I went from being the overlooked daughter to building a multi-million-dollar consulting firm. But what you might not know is that my real success didn't come from the business growth, or the financial recognition, or even the family inheritance that changed my life. I paused, thinking about the journey that had brought me to this moment. My real success came from learning that I didn't need anyone else's permission to value myself. It came from understanding that being the steady one wasn't a consolation prize. It was actually a superpower. And it came from realizing that sometimes the most radical thing you can do is simply refuse to accept less than you deserve. The standing ovation that followed wasn't just applause. It was recognition from women who understood exactly what I meant. That evening, I drove to my new house in the hills overlooking the city. It wasn't a mansion. I wasn't interested in showing off, but it was mine. Every square foot of it, from the home office where I still took client calls to the guest room that was always ready for friends who valued our friendship rather than what I could do for them. I poured myself a glass of wine and walked out to the balcony where I could see the city lights stretching out below me. Somewhere out there, Melissa was presumably rebuilding her life, hopefully making better choices for herself and her children. I genuinely hoped she was, though I no longer felt responsible for ensuring it. My phone buzzed with a text from my assistant, reminding me about tomorrow's board meeting for a nonprofit I'd joined, followed by another message from my parents suggesting dinner this weekend, and a third from James, the architect I'd been dating for 6 months, asking if I wanted to grab breakfast before his flight to Portland. Simple messages about a life filled with purpose, healthy relationships, and mutual respect. Nothing dramatic, nothing crisis-driven, nothing requiring me to sacrifice my own well-being for someone else's comfort. As I sat there watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of gold and pink, I thought about that night Melissa had shown up at my door, desperate and broken, asking for help. I'd spent months wondering if I'd made the right choice, if I'd been too harsh, if family loyalty should have trumped everything else. But sitting there in the peace I'd built for myself, surrounded by the life I'd created through my own choices and efforts, I knew I'd made the only decision that honored who I'd become. Sometimes the most powerful revenge isn't plotting someone else's downfall. Sometimes it's simply refusing to let their chaos define your worth. Sometimes it's building a life so fulfilling that their opinion of you becomes irrelevant. And sometimes walking away is the most powerful thing you can do.